He didn't speak like a movie general. He stomped up onto the half-track, rain and mud spattering his boots, and leveled a challenge at the men before him. Patton's voice cut through October fog like a pistol report. He had no patience for excuses, no interest in social experiments that failed. He needed tanks to move and fights to win. Color, he said, was irrelevant. What mattered was performance. That blunt bet, to put the 761st Tank Battalion into the thick of it as a fighting formation, would be paid for in steel and blood, and it would reverberate far beyond a single battlefield. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? The line of Shermans shivered under low clouds, their turrets fogged with condensation, crews hunched under oilskin and sweat. Around them, the men called themselves the Black Panthers, a name born of pride and of the hard need to stand together when so many others would rather look away. These were not raw recruits in the purest sense. They had trained for close to 2 years, drilled on gunnery and maintenance, on radio procedure and convoy discipline. But they had trained within an army still segregated by law and custom. The 761st carried an extra burden. Every success could be used to argue equality. Every failure would be magnified into a pretext for more prejudice. That double life, soldier and symbol, followed them into Europe. Patton's gamble was at once pragmatic and audacious. The Third Army needed armor with trained crews. The political and social calculus back home meant that assigning black soldiers to frontline armored combat was controversial. Patton stripped away the rhetoric and issued a challenge that left no room for half measures. He wanted fighting men who could move hard and shoot straight. He wanted results. The battalion understood. This was both an order and a test. To succeed would be to shatter expectations on the spot. To fail would risk feeding the worst assumptions of a country that still kept its people separate in uniform. Their baptism of fire came in the mud and fog of Lorraine in early November 1944, at a village variously recorded in sources, and here noted as Morville-les-Vicques. The ground was a wet, sucking thing that ate boots and bogged tracks. Visibility fell to a few yards. Anti-tank guns hid like vipers in hedgerows. For a tank crew, the world narrows in such moments. Periscope views, a blistered map smeared with grease, the radio's tinny clicks. Shermans were dependable machines, but not invulnerable. Their armor could be pierced by German high-velocity rounds. Their tracks vulnerable to mines. Their gasoline-fed fire could turn a crew compartment into an oven if a round struck ammunition stowage. In the fog, a single misstep could mean the loss of a gun and the men who rode it. The 761st moved through those conditions with the kind of improvisation that only combat teaches.
Scouts slipped through shelled orchards. A driver felt the change in the road and saved a hull from a buried mine by the merest inch. When German anti-tank fire found them, the battalion learned to use hull-down positions and to keep the turret traverse moving, to present a smaller profile, and to keep coaxial machine guns working to suppress infantry who might get close enough to nail a hatch. They tangled with German marksmen, and with heavier armored vehicles they were not meant to outgun. Tanks burned. Crews dismounted to fight as infantry when needed. They lugged extra sandbags and spare tracks. Gunners jammed stabilizers, and drivers learned to listen for the different pitch of a rounding shell. That first fight did not produce a triumphant parade. It produced hard, small victories. A farmhouse seized under fire, a gun position knocked out by a shot that found its embrasure. A wounded crewman passed from one medic to another while shells stitched the orchard sky. Casualties mounted, and grief moved down the line like a cold wind. But so did a new kind of respect. White comrades who had once looked past them now saw black grease on the faces of men who stayed in their tanks when everyone else wanted to pull back. Success and suffering did what words had not. They forced soldiers to measure each other by steel and nerve. The grind after Lorraine became its own enemy. Days stitched into nights with no sure cadence, maintenance crews working by flashlight under threat of shelling, cooks burning stew when shells sprayed the mess area, and tanks patched with whatever could be found. Men learned small tricks to survive: a block of wood to shore a shattered track, a roll of canvas to smother a smoldering engine, a means of jury-rigging a radio aerial from wire and hope. The battalion's appearance hardened. Grease and grime became a uniform in their own right. Crews stopped talking as much about the burden of representing a race and began talking, in that tight way soldiers do, about torque on the final drive and the easiest angle for crossing a plowed field without getting stuck. Into this steady pressure stepped one man, whose conduct would come to symbolize the unit's courage: Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers. He fought as if he had nothing left to prove except to the men who trusted him. Rivers led from the front. In one engagement near a place recorded as Quebling, his vehicle struck a mine. The blast ripped into the hull and into Rivers himself. His leg was grievously wounded. Medics urged evacuation. Command radios repeated the order: "Get him out, save him, bring in a replacement." Rivers refused. He crawled to the hatch, bloodied, and kept the radio, kept giving orders. For days he refused to be carried away, directing movement, calling target corrections, dragging himself from one tank to another as though the mission itself anchored him. That choice, to stay despite mortal injury, was not some theatrical gesture.
It was leadership in the rawest sense, the kind that tells men, "We go on." His decision cost him everything. When the battalion executed a withdrawal in the face of counterattacks, Rivers remained to cover the maneuver. He was killed during that action, cut down while giving his men the chance to live. There are no dramatic flourishes that fit such a death, only the clean, bitter fact of it. A leader, mortally wounded, refused to leave his men and paid the ultimate price while under fire. Rivers would be recognized decades later with the Medal of Honor in 1997, a posthumous correction to a slow ledger of history. That honor could not bring him back, but it fixed his name where courage and sacrifice could not be washed away. If Lorraine had taught the 761st the cruelty and the calculus of frontline armor warfare, the Ardennes would test their endurance in a different way. In December, with rain turning to ice and fuel lines stiff with cold, the battalion was hurled north. The road march to the Bulge was a trial of mechanics as much as men: engines that would not turn over in the gray dawn, tracks hardened by frost, crews spitting at ice that gathered on the exposed fittings. Tanks moved skirting ditch lines, their metal skirts rimed with frozen mud. Supply convoys crept behind them, and the occasional white flag of surrender hissed like an ember at the edge of a larger, muffled inferno. The 761st arrived into a battle that had been brewing since the German Ardennes offensive struck the Allied flank. Bastogne, that town ringed by snow and sergeants' stories of siege, needed relief. The battalion's task was immediate and brutal: cut through pockets of German armor and secure the flank so other units could reach the embattled paratroopers inside the town. The weather was a complicating factor that favored neither side wholly but punished both severely. Radio signals dropped in the snow, artillery couldn't always find its bearings, and moving at night meant slipping close to an enemy who knew the woods as well as any hunter. It was at a snowbound village identified in sources as Tilliet that the battalion nearly paid with its cohesion for an underestimation. Initially, a lead element blundered into a prepared German armor force, identified in some accounts as the 113th Panzer Brigade, dug in with anti-tank ditches and fieldworks. The engagement that followed had all the suddenness of a trap. A column stopped, a tank hit the mud wrong, a flank was exposed, and German main guns tuned to a longer range cut down what was available. For a moment, the battalion found itself stalled, the hulls of their Shermans taking direct hits or immobilizing blasts. Radio voices rose and fell in sharp, anxious bursts. What mattered in that crucible was adaptability. The battalion's leaders, company commanders and vehicle commanders alike, shifted tactics under fire.
They created smoke screens to blind German sightlines, not as theatrical obscuration, but as a tactic to deny the enemy that clean shot at the turret ring. Crews learned to work in pairs, one hull down to bait a track and name sequence, while the other flanked, using the broken hedgerows and house rubble to hide its approach. Infantry support that had seemed an afterthought became essential. Gunners dismounted to clear houses, while tanks provided direct fire support, their 75mm howitzers angled to punch through weak points in walls. The fighting condensed to the scale of yards and rooms, close-quarters brawls, where engineers and tankers swept buildings with experimental combinations of white phosphorus to flush defenders, and then charged to clear rooms. The 761st's response was not a cinematic solo charge theater. It was a painful, tactical school of improvisation and mutual sacrifice. A tank commander might give the order to lever his vehicle sideways on a slope to improve line of sight and expose the enemy's flank, counting on his own vulnerability to create a window for the platoon to exploit. Another crew would lay down a curtain of smoke while a small element slipped around a ruined mill and caught an anti-tank gun in the flank. That sequence, smoke, mobility, and flanking, repeated itself as doctrine turned into instinct. Slowly, methodically, the German line gave way. The 761st helped punch a hole in the enemy's position and secured a corridor that would allow relieving forces to reach Bastogne. It did not by itself win the battle for the Ardennes, but it altered the tactical balance in a sector where every hour and every yard mattered. Victory at Tillier cost dearly. Vehicle losses climbed. Crews mourned friends who had fallen inside armored shells. The battalion's faces took on the look of men who had seen too much too fast, a distilled combination of pride and fatigue, of satisfaction twisted with the hollow ache of survivors. That ache would be a companion for the 761st from that point forward. Their campaigns stretched along a trajectory of near-constant motion. Infantry support in urban fights, reconnaissance in broken country lanes, armor-on-armor clashes where hitting or being hit could come within the same breath. Across the months that followed, the battalion kept fighting. One measure that historians return to is the relentless nature of their commitment, 183 consecutive days in combat. That figure compresses into it a reality readers can hardly imagine. Weeks of continuous alert, minimal rest, and a maintenance backlog that never went away. Men replaced men in crews, sometimes mid-battle. New tankers arrived with fresh shoulders and nerves, and the veterans taught them the hard lessons. How to angle a hole to make a round glance, how to shovel out a jammed escape hatch, how to keep the radio alive when the wiring trembled with cold. Reinforcements could add numbers, but could not erase the emotional toll.
Casualty figures for the battalion rose toward near half of the unit over that period. Each number represented a name on a list, a letter delivered to a family, a blank seat at a mess table. The battalion endured tank losses that could be counted by the rusting frames left behind, and by the mechanics who scavenged parts from dead hulks to keep other machines running. Yet even in the face of such attrition, the 761st continued to fight with the same combination of competence and tenacity that had first caught Patton's eye. War has its moments of cold, moral triumph, as well as slaying. The battalion, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, came into contact with the atrocities that lay behind the front lines, scenes that no training had fully prepared them for. They trod into camps where the scale of human cruelty revealed itself in skeletal figures, piles of clothing, emaciated survivors whose eyes said they had outlived the meaning of the word normal. The 761st, like other units who arrived at such places, stood between the living and the dead and bore witness. Those moments added another complex layer to their service, fighting for a nation that had systematically denied them equal rights, while confronting an enemy whose crimes made clear a moral imperative beyond political hypocrisy. Liberating prisoners brought no tidy resolution to the injustices back home, but it demanded an honest note be struck in the ledger of history. These men had not only fought for territory, they had helped uncover truth. When the war finally drew a line through Europe and shipments of homeward letters began to supplant the cadence of radio reports, the 761st found that victory on foreign fields did not translate into immediate justice at home. Segregation persisted in neighborhoods, in public accommodations, in institutions. The men returned to a nation that still placed them in separate units or barred them from certain establishments. Some were denied benefits they had earned. Some who had seen the worst of humanity in Europe found themselves treated as second-class citizens on their own soil. That bitter juxtaposition, the triumphs of combat, and the sting of civic exclusion, shaped the battalion's legacy in ways that were both public and private. Institutional recognition came, but often years later. The battalion received official commendations only after long, often painful processes of review, and personal honors for figures like Reuben Rivers arrived decades after the guns went quiet. These delayed acknowledgments were important, but they also underline how societies can be slow to correct their own record. The 761st's combat record and the symbolic power of their service would over time contribute to broader changes, to arguments about the capacity of black soldiers, to the integration of the armed forces, and to a shifting public perception that could no longer so easily deny the competence and courage of these men.
Patton's decision to throw the 761st into combat was not simply an act of personal bravado. It was a calculated risk, rooted in operational need. The Third Army required reliable armored units that could hold ground and exploit breakthroughs. Patton's famous bluntness softened the political calculus in a way that allowed the battalion to demonstrate its worth where it would matter most, under fire. That single decision did not alter the entire course of World War II in isolation. It did, however, have outsized tactical consequences in the campaigns where the 761 fought. It helped open crucial lanes in the Ardennes and contributed to operations across Lorraine and into Germany. Equally important, it shaped the moral narrative of a nation at war with an external foe and with its own practices of racial exclusion. There is a distinct moral geometry to what happened. Patton's gamble placed black soldiers where their performance would be undeniable to anyone who watched. The battlefield does not care for racial theory, it measures by results. In that sense, the 761's triumph was both tactical and symbolic. Tactically, their actions materially aided operations in a theater where time and terrain were decisive. Symbolically, they cracked a public assumption that had been hardened by segregation, that black soldiers were unfit for high-stakes combat roles. The effect was not instantaneous or absolute, but measurable. Over time, the evidence of performance on those battered fields added weight to the arguments that would push the military toward integration. That progress, however, came at a steep cost. The battalion fought 183 days consecutively, sustained nearly 50% casualties across its membership, lost men like Reuben Rivers who would never know the full measure of their eventual recognition, and returned to a nation that still had more work to do. Their liberation of concentration camps added moral authority to their claim for equal treatment, but it didn't mandate it. The path from battlefield validation to societal transformation is messy and slow, and the 761's experience makes plain why. Yet there is a dignity in the ledger of those months that cannot be erased. The men of the 761's met anti-tank fire in Lorraine, improvised under shell-scarred roofs, learned to move and fight in the Ardennes blizzard, adapted to armored ambushes at Tilliat through the disciplined use of smoke and mobility, and stood in the ruins of Europe to witness and to document the extremes of human cruelty. They did so while carrying the extra burden of national scrutiny, knowing their successes might be used to change minds, and their failures might be used to preserve error. History remembers them now not as a footnote, but as an emblem of courage that reshaped conversations about race and military effectiveness.
Recognitions were slow in coming. A presidential unit citation awarded years after the war, and other honors that arrived decades after the bullets quieted. But honors, like memory, can be recovered and corrected over time. Reuben Rivers' Medal of Honor in 1997, for example, placed his name on a roster of national remembrance that would echo in classrooms and memorials in the decades after. The true alteration Patton's risk created was not a single headline or a dramatic political act. It was more subtle and ultimately more durable. By putting the 761st where the war demanded greatness, he forced a series of reckonings. Commanders and infantry units saw that the black tank crews could deliver under fire. Soldiers who had listened to prejudice in rear echelon quarters watched their comrades close by and learned an inconvenient reality. Valor and competence are colorblind under threat. That reality did not end discrimination overnight. Rather, it altered the moral calculus in ways that, added up over time, helped make integration and civil rights arguments harder to dismiss. When you imagine those winter roads and ruined villages, remember the small things that stitched real victory together. A loader's hand that kept a damaged breach clear through frost. A driver who reversed his tank to give another extraction cover. A radio operator's quick finger on a frequency that brought artillery on time. History tends to compress those details into a single phrase: the battalion fought bravely. But the truth is more tactile. Brave in the field meant precise maintenance at night by dim lantern. It meant sharing rations when supply broke down. It meant telling the rookie to take point because experience had taught which hedgerow hid the worst shots. There is also a hard lesson in how nations reward service. Recognition delayed is recognition still, but it is a bitter victory. The 761st's Presidential Unit Citation and Rivers Medal of Honor were corrections to a ledger, not erasers of the pain that accompanied the original neglect. To read their story with honesty is to see progress and also to see how slow historical justice can be. The Black Battalion's triumph, therefore, is twofold. On the battlefield, in the technical and brutal calculus of armored warfare, they proved themselves a combat-effective formation that contributed materially to key operations like the relief efforts around Bastogne. In the moral and civic sphere, their performance challenged and changed perceptions that had been entrenched in a segregated society. Patton's risk, his willingness to place them where success or failure would be undeniable, helped produce both outcomes. It was a gamble with immediate tactical returns and long-term symbolic power. When the men finally boarded ships home,
Their faces were not the faces of boys who had merely survived adventure. They were the faces of veterans who had been forced to grow up fast. They returned to a country that had asked them to fight for ideals they were not yet allowed to fully enjoy. Their legacy, though, did not stay buried in delayed citations. It became part of a larger, slow-moving momentum toward change in the armed forces and in American society. Their story entered history as proof. Courage under fire is an equal opportunity trait, and when given the chance, these men met both the Marshall test and the burden of representation with skill. Patton took a risk that put the 761st forward where history would not be able to ignore them. The battalion paid a high price. Tanks and men lost, wounds carved into a generation. They also won a kind of moral victory. By earning respect on the battlefield, they helped make it harder for a nation to justify keeping them separate at home. That is the meaning behind the title, The Black Battalion's Triumph. Not a triumph that erases cost, but one that altered the moral map of a country and complicated the military calculus of a world at war. If you want the sources and a deeper reading list on the 761st, check the description and subscribe for more military deep dives.